After the bloody days of the Old West, when scoundrels like Wild Bill Hickok, Billy the Kid, the Daltons, and Doc Holliday operated on both sides of the law, few of us who love Western lore expect to actually discover a genuine hero. Surely Hollywood would have discovered one by now. But there is one prominent lawman who is deserving of attention and has been almost systematically ignored. Francis Augustus Hamer, born in 1884, when the Wild West was supposedly winding down. His family called him Frank, but the Texas Rangers who knew him often called him Pancho. Like most boys in post-pioneer Texas, he grew up idolizing the Alamo heroes like David Crockett, and Texas Rangers like Samuel Walker and Leander McNally, men who made a path for civilization with guns and personal sacrifice. But conversely, there was a legion of offsprings of Western outlaws anxious to wrong the rights of Texas justice. Too many feuds had been settled, too many empires built with a short temper and a fast gun. Most young Texans took pride in being able to ride and shoot and fend for themselves. So reckless, deadly gunplay would be fairly common and continue for another generation. And out of this tough generation, a fierce lawman was forged, who rose to the lofty standards naively attributed to many undeserving lawmen of a generation before. Frank Hamer had his first gunfight as a mere teenager. While working on a ranch with his brother, their violence-prone boss tried to kill him, shooting him in the back with a shotgun. Only 16 years old and nearly dead, his brother Harrison managed to get him patched up, and when he was able, Frank returned to face Dan McSwain and shot him down. Then he went to his mother and spilled it all out. "Mother," he said, "I wanted to be a preacher, but from this hour on, I'm making a vow to God. I will pursue outlaws relentlessly and bring them to justice." And that is just what he did. But at this time, Frank and his brother Harrison and their friend Duke Hudson worked together on ranches all over far west Texas, becoming top hands for the Ketchum, Carr, and McKenzie ranches. Out in the last frontier, Frank perfected his shooting and tracking and hunting skills, which became legendary. Tough and adventurous and terminally independent, Frank Hamer was almost lured into the outlaw life when a local ne'er-do-well seduced him and his co-workers into a bank holdup scheme. They were going to rob a bank in San Angelo, Texas, and set up a ranch in Mexico. But Frank backed out at the last moment and made a critical choice that would set his path for life. Over the next couple of years, he helped lawmen capture several horse thieves and Texas Ranger captains, since they had in their midst a budding lawman. Hamer knew the land and seemed to understand the criminal mind, and had a knack for cutting them off at the pass. As Sheriff Dud Barker of Fort Stockton once explained, he had the ability to grasp the situation quickly. So Frank readily joined the Texas Rangers in 1906 when they recruited him. At 22, he was 6'3" and weighed 193 pounds. He had already proven he could track, arrest, and even kill bad men. Frank's Lilliputian human shadow, Duke Hudson, was not far behind. They both ended up in Company C of the Texas Rangers, based in Sheffield, but were headed to a baptism of fire in Del Rio, right on the Mexican border. Led by the legendary Captain John H. Rogers, 4 young Rangers ended up surrounding Ed Putnam, a desperate killer, holding hostages, on the outskirts of town. Putnam let his hostages go, but determined to take out as many Rangers as he could before they ended his murderous tirade. After an hour of hellfire and hundreds of bullets, Private Hamer put himself in a vulnerable position, but ended the shootout with a well-placed Winchester round, which passed through Putnam's head and stopped inside his black heart. And a Texas legend was born, cutting its teeth on a vanishing breed, a generation of men caught between the wild old days of the American West and the modern age. Over and over, Frank Hamer would be the man history would often choose to send this kind of man to perdition. And Texas was full of them. The Western gun culture was a runaway train, and Texas citizens were begging for law and order, but there were a few men who could stand against it. The next stop on his trail to notoriety was the Brazos Valley town of Navasota. The Navasota City Council had pleaded to the governor to send a ranger to settle down a series of feuds that had left perhaps 100 or more people dead. They had been helped before by Sergeant John Debrell of Company C and requested his permanent assignment to their troubled battlefield. But Debrell had already seen all he wanted of the incorrigible Texas town, which had been through several city marshals in so many years. The last marshal had resigned when his finger was shot off. The governor acquiesced, but Debrell politely declined the invitation. Frank Hamer was listening to the governor's request and saw an opportunity to land a real job and sleep in a real bed and draw real wages. He reported to work in Navasota in the latter part of 1908. He was just 24 years old. The city council took one look at the thin, pretty-faced youth and openly doubted his potential, but they had no choice. He was the only man crazy enough to take the job. Still, he was a Texas Ranger, and he had come highly recommended. In fact, the Texas Rangers may have sent the best man they had. The very first day on the job, an old Southern warhorse confronted him, drunk, raising hell in the street, even laughing at him, letting off the famous rebel yell, defying his authority, as all of downtown Navasota watched with a mischievous grin. Newly sworn in, Marshal Hamer warned him, and when he cocked his head back to let off another rebellious yell, the marshal grabbed him by his beard, threw him down like a steer, and mopped up a little Navasota mud, and then put him in jail. The battle of wills had begun. But Sergeant Debrell had been right. Navasota was not going down easy. A man who would tame her had to be willing to roll up his sleeves and kick some tail. Every day. And that is what Hamer did. Literally, in fact, he became notorious for kicking his suspects so often and so hard with his long, powerful legs that they ran to the jail when he pointed in that direction. Hamer often had to arrest whole gangs, so one of the first things he did was to outlaw handguns in the city limits. He drove around town fully armed in a makeshift paddy wagon. Marshal Hamer hired a little boy right out of the cotton fields to drive his buggy and show him around his new domain. His name was Mance Lipscomb, one day to be recognized as one of the most important blues performers of his time. But for now, he was Hamer's 12-year-old guide and navigator in the alleys and backroads of Grimes County. Lipscomb later recalled the shooting prowess of the young ranger. "The purtiest white man I ever saw," he claimed, who routinely shot and hit moving targets from the buggy while out on country rides. But Lipscomb also remembered that Hamer tried to avoid gunplay with criminals, but his feats were always loaded, he would say. Young and impressionable, Mance Lipscomb proudly rode around the town, watching a miracle, a wholesale attitude adjustment, happening before his eyes. Assisted by his old ranger crony, Deputy Marshal M.E. Bailey, Hamer was uncompromising, but fair, and a protector of blacks, who had suffered many injustices. And although there were some shootings, relatively few men were killed during the years he served in Navasota. In fact, he raised more eyebrows by killing the murderous bulldog belonging to a hotel owner who had refused to keep him on a leash. Outlaws of black, white, or canine persuasion were soon looking for any place where Frank Hamer wasn't. In a couple of years, Frank Hamer had come to another crossroad. He had settled down. He'd gotten married and tamed a town. And he had proven he was effective, cool-headed, and not going to abuse the power of his badge. But more importantly, he could stay alive. Relentlessly recruited by Mayor Baldwin Rice, in 1911 he went to work in the big, wide-open city of Houston. Houston was the perfect place for a young, ambitious policeman to find action. Frank found plenty of it. Soon he was making headlines as he bagged notorious criminals and began to make a statewide reputation. But when a sarcastic journalist attacked him in his editorial and questioned his integrity, he went to him and slapped him around to teach him some manners. But this was a time of transition. Society had begun to have different expectations of their peacekeepers. When the smoke had cleared, Frank Hamer was personally and professionally ruined by the controversy, as his wife could not stand the humiliation. He was soon leaving Houston without a job or a wife. Houston was no place for a West Texas cowboy who could not fight or at least threaten his enemies with his six-shooter. Nevertheless, without much fanfare, the young lawman from West Texas had transitioned from chasing horse thieves on the high plains to chasing automobile thieves in the fast lane. These constant successful transitions would be the story of his life. Frank took some various assignments, eradicating cattle rustlers, and even came back to Navasota in 1913 and worked under City Marshal Marvin Bailey, busting up the remnant of a car theft ring he had investigated in Houston. This was when Navasota attorney Conlaw Spann presented him with Old Lucky, a fine engraved Colt revolver which he carried the rest of his life. But by now he had added the Colt automatic pistol to his arsenal, and, fully equipped for action, was seeking to return to the job he was born for. By 1915, Frank was back in Company C of the Texas Rangers, living a world away, in fact, a timeless frontier on the border with Mexico. It was around this time that Frank Hamer met Zane Grey, the most celebrated Western novelist of all time. Looking for the quintessential story about the Texas Rangers, the young author was traveling around West Texas and soon published his iconic novel, Lone Star Ranger, the precursor to The Lone Ranger. The pulp novel was about a young Western survivalist who, like Hamer, swears an oath of vengeance on outlaws. Gray's protagonist was eventually adapted for radio by Fran Stryker and called The Lone Ranger. Zane Grey's ultimate ranger was a former outlaw, very handsome, in fact a lady killer, had to duck to get through doorways, and wore two guns, one high on the left, one lower on the right. And he spoke only when he had to. He was a crack shot with a handgun, an instinctive killer, an alpha male in a man-created hell. It was no coincidence that this was a very accurate description of Ranger Frank Augustus Hamer. This photograph of Frank Hamer was found among Zane Grey's photograph collection and captured the very essence of the Lone Star Ranger. It is obvious that the two men knew each other and that there was much more to the story of the man behind the mask. It is ironic about a man who was the veritable arm of justice that Frank Hamer's career is impossible to do justice. The tales of his courage and professionalism are almost unbelievable.